Okay, for everyone here at the lecture hall and for those joining us online, we're going to get started in about a minute or two. Thanks for joining us. Okay, I think we're all set to get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful day before Earth Day. My name is Jennifer Wong. I'm the executive director of the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. I just wanted to give a really quick reflection that 55 years ago in 1970, Earth Day began as a national teach-in on the environment at a time when Americans were just becoming aware of the effects of pollution on the environment and on human health. Think Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, or the fire on Cleveland's Cuyahoga River in 1969. Earth Day, in fact, was a time to be held on April 22nd when it started to maximize the number of students that could be reached on university campuses. So we welcome all the students, faculty members, and community members who are joining us today. Earth Day was the brainchild of Senator Gaylord Nelson and was inspired by the protest movements of the 1960s with the idea that bringing environmental causes into the national spotlight, we could shake up the political establishment and force this issue onto the national agenda. Indeed, the first Earth Day was effective at raising awareness and transforming public opinion and public attitudes, and kicked off a decade of important environmental legislation like the Clean Air Act, Water Quality Improvement Act, Endangered Species Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, and the establishment of the EPA. While these landmark legislation are facing challenges as we stand now is not the time to give up. Now is the time to keep going, to defend healthy, clean environments and a stable climate where everyone can thrive. And that is our vision here at the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health and across Yale. The idea of teach-ins, of speaking up and speaking out, of mass communication, of meeting people where they are, and of coming together to share knowledge and co-create solutions, that is the moment that we are in now. So with that, I just want to say thank you, Alejandra, for joining us today. To the Poynter Fellowship in Journalism at Yale for making this event possible. The Poynter Fellowship for over half a century has been bringing the world's leading truth seekers and creative storytellers to Yale. So it's an incredible opportunity for the university and for us as a climate and health community to be able to benefit from that and bring Alejandra here. Thanks also to our co-sponsors, the Yale Office of Sustainability, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, and YSE's Climate Change Science and Solutions Learning Community. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Alex Rockman, who is our program administrator here at the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health, to introduce Alejandra.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Before we start, I want to give a disclaimer that views expressed during this discussion are those of the participants and that this lecture is being recorded. So Alejandra Borunda is a reporter on NPR's Climate Desk, where she covers the intersection of climate change and health. She reports on how climate change is affecting people's bodies and minds and how people can and are protecting themselves and others. Before Borunda joined NPR in 2023, she wrote about climate science and environmental issues for Nat Geo, National Geographic, where she reported on glacier retreat in Greenland, shade and heat inequity in Los Angeles, climate change's impact on ice fishing in the Great Lakes, and much more. She has a PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences from Columbia University, where she studied how tiny dust particles in the atmosphere affected climate change thousands of years ago. And with that, I'm going to welcome Alejandra.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Wait, do I actually know how to slide change? Oh, there we go. I think. Hi, I'm so glad to be here. And thank you for the kind introduction. Wait, but sorry. They go up and down.
Oh, so just right here.
Oh, down that. Okay. Yes. Great. That should be obvious. There we go. Great. Yeah. So I'm Alejandra. I am really glad to be here. I'm on NPR's climate team, as Alex said. And I have a really interesting beat there, which is, as you all know, figuring out how to help people understand that climate change is actually hurting their bodies sometimes, and that there are ways to make that less of a problem. Um, I'm just really glad to be here. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity in this space, as I'm sure you are all very aware of, because climate change is this big, scary thing to a lot of people still. Most of us, many of your colleagues have demonstrated, understand that it exists, that it's a problem, but a lot of people still don't seem to understand that it is impacting them personally now in a way that they can actually understand in a more concrete sense. This is some work from the Yale Center on Climate Change and Communication that I just think is really interesting because we've seen all of these trends over the years in terms of the number of people who accept that there is a problem out there, but very few are still acknowledging that it's there for themselves personally right now. Okay, I will try to be, yes, great. And I think there's some interesting questions about why. And I think part of this is just because this is a relatively new but rapidly expanding field in the research, on the research side, as you all know. And I think we haven't done a great job of communicating to people and making them understand exactly how these things are affecting them. So our project on the climate desk and my project personally at NPR is to try to help them get a really tangible sense of this. Like when it's hot outside, how much hotter is it? How much more risk are we facing? How much are we dealing with wildfire smoke in a way that we actually would not have had to deal with in the past? And like, I think of this in a really simple way. It's about making something that is like not actually visible in many cases, visible, understandable, tangible. So I'm going to go through this in about 4 chapters. And I think hopefully this will make sense. We're going to start by talking a little bit about climate journalism more broadly and how both the field of journalism and kind of the research space have changed in tandem over the past decade or so, because I think that actually tells us a lot about where we are in the storytelling process today. And then I'm going to have a kind of practical section about how we journalists actually go from the science that many of you produce and turn it into a story. And there's some really useful nuts and bolts stuff there that I think is helpful both for researchers and for storytellers. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we know makes stories work for listeners or readers, our final end users, and a little bit about what we know doesn't. And then I'm gonna very quickly talk about the future and where we go in this very interesting moment in time and in communications more broadly. But yeah, hopefully this will make sense. So I want to start a little bit by talking about how climate journalism has changed over the years. And I'll weave a little bit of my story in there too, because I think it's kind of informative. Back when I graduated from college a million years ago, there really wasn't much of a climate journalism world out there. Like New York Times had one person covering climate change. The Post picked someone up a couple years later, but like it was one person out there trying to translate all of the science that was being published into something that was more accessible and reasonable, or just accessible to most people in the world. And it was really focused on what I like to think of as like capital S science. It was like, does climate change exist? What do we know about how CO2 influences temperature on Earth. And that was kind of a product of a lot of other social and political issues at the time, which we could have a whole other lecture about. And I think it really set us up to have a very particular understanding of what climate change meant to people and what climate communications was, which is like, we have to be rigorous, we have to be very specific, and we have to tell people exactly what the science is saying and not one step further. And that's how we're gonna do this project and this work. That changed very quickly, starting in about the 2010s. And which is actually when I was in journalism school for climate journalism in the first place. I went there in 2009, I think, did a master's in earth science at Lamont, went to the journalism school at Columbia for a year, came out and was like, there are no jobs for me. Like, there are not climate journalism jobs out there. So I went back to school, did a lot more science. And while I was in the rest of my PhD program, the landscape changed entirely. By the time I graduated, I mean, I think the Times had 12 or 15 people on staff. The Post was not quite there, but now they have 30 people on their climate team. That's wild, that's amazing. And there was this rapid expansion in interest, I think, from a lot of the public, and people wanted to understand the nuance of the issue a lot more completely, honestly. And they were kind of tired of the back and forth about whether climate change existed or not. They're like, okay, what are we gonna do? So we see in this time a real evolution of climate journalism writ large. That means a lot more stories that are a lot more nuanced. That means a lot more stories that are reaching across beat spaces. We stop being in the science section only and develop people's expertise in climate's impact on business, in climate's impact on, agriculture is a good example. Health was very late to that game. Health has only emerged as a question that any newsrooms are interested in, I would say, in the last couple of years. My position at NPR was one of the first there are 3 people in the country that I can think of my job, which is really interesting. Like, we could talk a lot about why that is and why it's taken so long. So I think it's most of what I want to say about this. There's also a really strong interest, I think, right now in framing climate stories not just as harms happening to us, but as like figuring out the ways that we can have agency in this process, which you all know. Everyone wants solutions, whether or not the solutions are realistic. So that's a whole other space to explore. And I think I just wanted to say quickly that the journalism side of things has evolved really alongside the research and policy work as well. And I think there's just a couple kind of really important moments in that. I think the national climate assessments have evolved quite a bit in the last few decades, or the last few versions, and they've aimed to become a lot more accessible and comprehensive and outward-looking, communications-focused. And that's a great development. I think we can see a lot of moments when researchers have also kind of moved out of the, I hate the term ivory tower, but like tried to become more engaged in public research and community-focused research in a way that is not always successful, but is quite interesting in many spaces. Just anecdotally, like while I was in grad school, in the first years, almost no one from my institution was speaking publicly about climate change. They felt, it's not entirely true. There were certainly people, but like there were a lot of people who felt that their role was science, and that changed quite dramatically over the course of just a couple of years. I think like by the end, many, many, many people and almost all the postdocs and grad students were involved in some kind of communication project. In the climate and health space in particular, I think we've seen, as you all know, like a massive mobilization, had been seen a massive mobilization in funds and research and interest, and this goal of harmonizing a lot of the work across both academic institutions and interest from across many different agencies in the government. How that was working is an interesting question, but there was interest in doing so. The future, we'll see. Oh, I'll just mention one other thing. I think we talked about this with the students, but I think there was a moment of great excitement amongst many of the people that I talked to when health got added to the COP agenda as well. So I basically said this, but I think that it's really interesting that the expansion of both the research space, the policy space, and the journalism space at once has really opened up a lot of opportunities for good storytelling, and storytelling that is like a lot more nuanced and interesting than I think what we used to have. And that's just like what happens as a field evolves. So we're going to take a little pivot here and talk about how we actually make the work. How do we take the science that you all do and turn it into something that people want to listen to on NPR? This is too many words for a slide, but just wanted to have it all in one place. And I think there's like quite a lot to learn here. So there are basically 3 steps. And a mentor of mine once told me many years ago that science and journalism are not actually that different. It's question-based inquiry. It's like you want to learn something about the world, you go out and you research and you find all the data and evidence and information that, you sometimes have a hypothesis. I feel like I'm much more of a vessel and a receptacle of the outside world than maybe I am when I'm trying to answer a specific science question. But we go out, we gather evidence, we do our reporting, and then we come back and we try to synthesize it all. So the first thing that we do in any case is try to figure out what our idea is. Like, what are we trying to learn right now? And I usually frame them as questions. You probably have heard at some point, if you've ever done any journalism or comms, that there's a difference between a story and a topic. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Cool. A topic might be climate and health, might be air pollution impacts on kids' learning. A story really drills down much more closely. I have 800 words, maybe less than that if it's a radio story. I can answer one question. And so in that, like, a question version version of the air pollution issue would maybe be like, what is the impact of rolling back the funding opportunities for electric school buses on kids learning in X community or Y community, or in this particular place, or for a particular group of people? And so what I would do is take that question and then do my research and start to call all of you. I'm going to do a literature review. I'm going to see what people have researched and what they've done and what we know about diesel fumes on school buses and what we know about diesel fume impacts on learning. And that's a point where I'm going to talk to you a lot in this reporting part. I'm going to consult with you. I'm going to ask you questions and be like, is this a stupid idea? And you can tell me yes. You can tell me no. You can be like, actually, I think this other thing you should be working on is this. And then I'm going to also reach beyond that. I'm going to talk to policy people. I'm going to figure out where the most interesting things are happening in this space and go there. So I might go to Michigan, or I might go to Atlanta and talk to the communities that are actually dealing with the problem as well. And then we're going to go turn it into an actual story. This part doesn't really matter, but I think what's important for all of you to know is that the story production process for us is very rigorous. We have a particular set of formats that we're interested in and need to produce for. So a digital story, a couple different types of radio stories, sometimes a podcast. And we're really thinking about how we can format those different stories for specific audiences, right? Like, the national space is really hard because we don't really get to talk to specific audiences, but we do know that our podcast audiences are quite different from our broadcast radio audiences, who are different from our digital audiences. So we have a little bit of opportunity within the production space to start to pick out different details or different pieces of tape or different pieces of information, even to try to make the stories as not palatable, but just interesting and compelling to different groups of people. But there's a real limit to what we can do when you're talking to the entire country at once. I guess my only other plug here is that this process can be as quick. I think the fastest we've ever produced a story was like 30 minutes when news breaks. And I called a bunch of sources that I knew already and was like, please, can you get on the phone with me right now for 5 minutes and tell me what you think? And turn around and produce something. And I think it goes live on ATC half an hour later, all things considered. The timeline can also extend for months or even years if we're working on a really complicated thing. So in these moments when we're reaching out to you as journalists, we really appreciate and value your time. It's not always possible to talk to us on our timelines, but we are so, so, so grateful when you can. And if you have a relationship with us ahead of time, if we've talked to you in the past, it makes it a lot more likely for us to reach out to you in these moments when we like really need you, which may be good or bad depending on your perspective. But if being more involved in the news process is something that's interesting to you, this is a place to plug in. Like when we call you, please pick up the phone or email us back. I skipped ahead a little bit. I just want to mention one other thing kind of on this ideas end of this slide. The kind of origination ideas of our work come from a lot of different places, and one of those places includes you. Of course, I'm talking to sources in the communities that I'm interested in. We're responding to news, but we're also getting a lot of, or doing a lot of our work, at least on my team and in many of the other climate teams around the country that I know of, from science itself. Like, we are a science-focused desk. And so that means I'm reading the journals, I'm going to conferences, I'm talking to you, hopefully. And that's a really, like I was just saying, like that's a good place for us all to be in communication. So if you're publishing a paper, send it to me ahead of time. If I reach out to you to ask you for comment about someone else's work, like we can talk about that work and then you can tell me about what else you're doing. So I just want to make that plug. Please talk to us. It's really fun. So these are 3 quick examples of kind of different types of stories that we might produce. It always feels weird to have all my own work up there, but it's trying to do better about it. So on this one, right. This was just what we call a study story that I produced a couple weeks ago. And that's like the most straightforward kind of science story that you might be familiar with. Like there was a research study that came out, I think this one was in Science Advances. It's an interesting question. I've been really interested in how all of these different environmental exposures have or play out epigenetically. So I saw this paper come out. It's like, I want to talk to these researchers. It's pretty straightforward. I called the people who did the work, 3 to 5 researchers who aren't them, asked them about all these things. It's a pretty plug and play formula that we have for these kinds of stories, but they're really interesting. And this one got so much, I think this was like several 100,000 views and listens. Like people were interested in it. Another type of story that we do that often involves science is just like a straight news story. And on our desk, we try to rely on the science really heavily. So, you know, earlier this year, there's an atmospheric river that was about to hit California. I was like, we could do this as a straight, like, this thing is about to happen piece, but it's much more interesting if we can talk about the climate drivers of this atmosphere, or whether there are or are not climate drivers, because that's a nuance that we're like very open to. Sometimes there aren't demonstrable effects, and that's like helpful for people to know as well. Yeah, so these stories are usually pretty straightforward, but we like to bring in a lot of researchers and context to help people understand what these phenomena are and how they might be changing. And then the last are what we think of as features. So something that is like neither exactly news and probably incorporates more studies than just one, but we're asking some bigger question and using science to kind of help us explore it and explain it. And so that story was about, this was after the LA wildfires, and I actually don't know why I put this here. But scientists in that case could be the same kind of thing, someone that adds context. In some cases, you are the main character that we like to follow as you do your research. That's a well-worn, well-trodden feature path. Yeah, and in all of these cases, like we are incorporating a lot of science. I wanted to talk a little bit about one other specific project too, and a thing that I personally am really interested in, and I know a lot of other people at other outlets are doing as well. And this is this question of like co-creating storytelling with researchers and scientists. I personally well, I mean, I'm like a bit of a weird case, but there's actually quite a few former researchers in journalism roles, especially on climate teams across the country. So you'll run into us and we'll ask you really nerdy questions usually. And in my case, I just have this like interest in still trying to do some version of research and asking a lot of questions that I know you are as well. And in some cases, we can do that. So there's this project that we've been working on, sort of been on hold because things have been a little busy for the last many months. That came up out of a lot of conversations that I was having with people when I started this job. And I was calling people up and I was like, what are the big questions in the climate and health space? What do you want us to be thinking about and talking about? And over and over and over again, I was hearing from people that there's this issue that people are dying because of issues related to climate change, extreme heat, wildfire smoke exposure, flood exposure, and their deaths are not being accurately counted as such. And that, of course, gets me really interested as a former researcher because I'm like, what? We have to be able to do this. Like, there is a way. We know how to do this. Excess mortality is a thing. Of course, you'd all been working on it already and thinking about it. And so we've been trying to work on developing we have been developing some partnerships with researchers. Not here, Kai, if you're listening, we should continue to talk about this. To try to answer this question, not in as quite as rigorous a way as you might for a publication, but to be able to do some real storytelling about it, to answer these questions. Who are these people who are dying? Why don't we know what happened to them? Can we start to explore these questions? And so my colleagues and I have started this project called the Undercount. And the foundation of the whole project is science. We are working on some epidemiological analyses. We hopefully are going to get county level data. It's a little bit up in the air right now because of data access questions. And it's in process. And so one of the reasons we wanted to do this as a journalism project and not as just a purely research project, of course, is that we actually have found that people don't really respond super well to being told that they're dying and there's this big problem and it's a real downer and everything's terrible. We've written a lot of stories about the studies that tell us that, and it's a tough sell. They do respond when the issue is in the news, if like when the wildfire smoke was coming to the East Coast and all of a sudden everyone was like, oh my God, this is gonna happen to me. And maybe I should think about the consequences. That's the moment when we can get them. But in general, it's like a pretty hard thing to get people to listen to. But what we have found is that people are really interested in this question when we can get to them in slightly less direct ways. So I did this story about a medical examiner in Tucson, not in Phoenix. The Phoenix or the Maricopa County guys are, well, the whole team is amazing. This is a guy in a much smaller county working on a similar project, but like with a slightly different approach. And people were really into this. It was a version of the story that they hadn't heard before. They were like, I never get to hear from medical examiners. This guy's kind of a character. He's wonderful. And we managed to engage them on this larger issue by coming at it a slightly sideways angle, less of a telling you and more of a, can we pique your curiosity and see where things go from there? And the other way that we found that they really respond to things is when the stories, I mean, quite frankly, are just very good and very personal. My colleague, Rebecca Hersher, who is an amazing journalist, started working on this series of what we're calling climate obituaries, where we identify the counties, or we're not at the county level at that point, but we will be soon, the regions where we know that people are dying at rates much higher than are being reported in any official statistics. And then we go find them. We go find the people who, like Wilmer, died of heat exposure. He's a roofer outside of my Fort Lauderdale, Florida, who was working incredibly hard during the middle of the summer heat. And he had essentially the symptoms of heat stroke, went home and died the next day. And so when his body was sent to the medical examiner, to the coroner, heat was not listed on his death certificate. Well, I'm still confirming that, but there are these, basically, like, he showed up and they had no way to basically figure out if heat had been been a component, and they didn't investigate deeply. And so his brother, his partner, everyone in his life knows what happened, but he would never be listed on any official statistics. And so Becky did this incredible interview with his brother, who is also a roofer, who has watched his brother die in the exact same conditions in which he's working on a regular basis, and created the story that is, like, I hope you all listen to it. I'll send some links afterwards. It's really beautiful. And she's done a series of these climate obituaries. And those, despite their heaviness and their intensity, are things that people are really interested in. It brings this large conceptual concept down to a very personal level. So I kind of transitioned into this already, a little bit telling you about what makes a story work, but we'll get into it a little bit more now. I think what we've sort of come to realize is that we really, really have to start from this community focus. There are times when we can do that big national study story, but most of the time, if we can make it about a specific place or a specific person and use them to explore the broader implications of whatever we're interested in, that is the thing that will actually get people to listen to the end. And that's like all we're trying to do. Like, we want you to get in, because that's when we can share the information. If you're not going to listen in the first place, like, we got nothing. And so we know that there's a couple things that work particularly well to get people in. There's some like very basic questions about people's own personal health and safety that work really well. And if we can like start with that, we can then add on this climate context at the end. So we generally split we think about it in kind of 3 different bins right now, at least in the US. We think about wildfire smoke exposure, we think about heat, and we think about flooding. Obviously, there are a lot more parts to this story. I mean, I actually didn't put infectious disease in here, but I've done plenty of stories about dengue, about Lyme, about all of these other ways that people can get hurt. But these are kind of the main pieces that are on our radar at all times. Side note, between about June and October of every year is kind of like our Super Bowl, our ongoing Super Bowl. It's a terrible time. We're just ready for any kind of climate disaster that can happen. And it's basically going to happen. Something's going to happen every couple weeks at this point. So this is the time of the year when we're really preparing. And then we know that we're just going to be in response explainer mode for the rest of the summer and early fall. So anyway, what do we know works for these different kind of buckets of stories, for wildfire stories, for example? We got a really good example of this just earlier this year with the LA wildfires. I'm based in California. It was chaos. It was absolutely, I don't know, it was some of the most intense weeks of my reporting life. And it was really hard, but there was also, I was telling the students before this incredible opportunity and moment of interest. Like, I had people from Los Angeles texting and calling me asking about air quality in a way that I have never had people engage with me before. I cover air quality. You can't get people to listen to a story about air pollution to save your life most of the time. It's really hard. And all of a sudden, there's this moment when people were like, tell me how the EPA air monitors work. Tell me what else we can possibly measure for. How do I read the AQI maps? What is purple air? And this, I think, was like a real moment for me to be like, okay, I just have to be ready. I have to have 7 stories ready to go for when something happens. I have to have the explainers. I have to have the papers, like studies ready. And we have to take advantage of these moments because we're in an attention economy. Attention is limited. When people want to listen, we have to be ready to talk. And so what we learned from that were that people really, really want these very practical stories about air quality, water quality, any toxic exposure thing. Those were the main ones. And then we also got this feedback that people were really interested in, not, again, the sad they were interested in the like, I've lost everything personal narratives. But when there was something kind of more concrete to grab onto, they liked that too. So we did this story about this little pop-up health event run by the Red Cross after the wildfires, and they were making people's glasses on site. And we talked with this lovely 86-year-old woman who had had to evacuate her house so quickly that she left her glasses behind, which is like inconceivable to me as a former glasses wearer. But that's how fast it was. It was like minutes. And people really liked this story, I think, because it gave them this kind of bite-sized way to get into this larger tragedy. And it was also kind of not solutions focused exactly, but forward looking. It was like, we are doing something here. There are people, there are groups here to help this old woman get another pair of glasses. And this is actually, I put this in here too, because the fun outcome from this, which is that a local glasses company ended up donating a lot of new frames to this group that was doing the on-demand glasses piece. And we don't usually get a lot of feedback about what our stories do. And that was really cool to be like, oh no, they heard something, they wanted to help, and then they did. That was wildfire smoke. Heat. Heat is a thing that people are very interested in. They understand it very clearly. The connection to climate, incredibly clear. Oh, sorry. You can go a long way with that. So we did a lot of stories last year that were the kind of news you can use pieces. We talked about the National Weather Service's heat risk product, and people were interested in that. We talked a lot about federal and state level heat policy. Those were stories that people were absolutely fascinated by. I would start to talk about them with non-journalist friends, and they'd be like, wait, excuse me, do we not have any rules protecting people from heat? And I would be like, no, we do not. In fact, several states do, but most do not. And it's just one of these interesting kind of spaces where I think a lot of people, what it taught me is that like a lot of people think that we have a lot more tools than we do. And anytime we can kind of point that out and show that there is something else, there's a different way to be moving through this world if we choose to, I think people really relate to that. So yeah, I put this story up here just because it was, yeah, one of our most, I think I was on Up First about this. They really wanted, OSHA was starting the process to produce a federal heat rule to protect people, protect workers from heat, and it would apply to both indoor and outdoor workers. The status of that is unclear right now, but it got people really excited to think that there's something to do. And then I guess here too, we also want to talk about just those personal stories. So Wilmer, the roofer I was talking about earlier in Florida, a story from Tucson that I worked on last year, which we might play later if we have time. But I went and profiled some lovely seniors who were working on a community scale project to protect each other from heat waves, where they would go and check on each other. And it's quite effective. So there's these like small solutions that people can work on as well. But yeah, it's kind of this mix of like news you can use, practical things. What is the landscape at the federal, local, state scale? And then like, let's bring it down to one person and one place. So those are kind of our, oh, actually, I'm not going to play this right now. I'll send you the, or you'll have the link, but it's just it's a very sweet story, I think. And yeah, I will say actually, I did want to say one more thing about this, which is this story, I think actually, this is the story of the seniors in Tucson. And it was a useful project for us because I actually did not intend to collect the tape that we used for this for a study story. And then a study came out. I'd gone to Tucson. I'd been talking with these seniors as part of this larger reporting trip. I collected this tape. It was sitting there. We were going to do a story about it later. And this study came out. I think this was a Kai study, actually, that looked at the dual risks of a warming planet and an aging population, and how those two things together were going to vastly increase the number of seniors who are at risk from heat exposure in coming years and decades. And this paper came out, and we could have done it as a really straightforward study story, like I was talking about before. One scientist talks, another scientist talks. We all know, we come out knowing the answer, but as I said before, we know those don't always do great, and they don't always get the audience. So I realized we had this tape of a bunch of seniors talking about this exact problem, and we managed to use that to illustrate the study story. And I mean, I have no counterfactual to actually offset this too, but I think the story did better than it would have. And it was certainly much more engaging to work on and hopefully to listen to, because we had, again, these like very personal stories. And that's not an approach that we can do all the time, but if it is ever possible, that is how I would prefer to tell these stories. Yeah, just on the flooding. Flooding's a lot harder. There's, I mean, as I'm sure you all know, the epidemiology is a little bit trickier to pinpoint. There's a lot more questions about the attribution on kind of all sides of things. But I think we're getting a lot closer to being able to tell these more nuanced stories and really link the climate impacts with the health outcomes. We've got a couple stories in the works about this, and Becky has one other really beautiful climate obituary about one of the major flood events in Kentucky and a person who died of basically mental health complications after the flooding impacted him. So I encourage you all to listen to that one as well. So I just wanted to come back to this main idea. Like in our business, like timing is everything. People don't have a lot of attention. They just don't. I don't. I have 7 stories I'm supposed to be working on right now. Like it's just the reality of the situation. And so a thing that I'm trying to do better, I know our team is really focused on, and many people across this practice space are thinking about, is how to better bring people the information that we hope they have in the moment when they can actually hear it. And that's a real challenge sometimes when we're working with science, because we are on very different timelines. Like everyone in this room, I'm sure, is going to publish a study that I would love to write about or highlight or focus on at some point. But if you send me a heat study in December, there's not a lot I can do with it at that moment. So insofar as you can try to publish things, I mean, I know it's not possible. I know the journals don't work like that, but like, what's a good example? I think that last year, a big hurricane study, tropical cyclone study came out like when Milton was approaching Florida, and we're like, great, we can do a story about this right now. And that person got so much attention. So I don't know. Anyway, all I'm saying here is that like, we really need to work on timing, and in as much as you can, if you can help us with that, that is great. That could be just sending us your work in the moment when it's happening. Like, shoot a paper my way, send me an email, be like, I published this in March, and I know it's July now, but that's still pretty recent, and you couldn't cover it then. Can you cover it now? I am very open to that. We are very happy to do that. And often what we do are these like science roundups in the moment where an event is happening. And so if you want your work on my radar, talk to your PIOs, talk to me directly, just get it in front of my face. That's very, very helpful. Yeah, these are all just examples of that. And so I guess this is really where we are now. And this is the question, like, what are we going to do from here? Like, we are constantly in the journalism business trying to think about what we can possibly do to do our work better, to reach more people more deeply, to help just give people the information they need to make decisions for themselves. And I think that's a complicated project at any point. And it's particularly complicated right now. Not because of all the things that are going on, but also just because of the shape of the news landscape at this moment. This is a Times map from, who is it? Local News Initiative at Northwestern, which I think is a really wonderful project. And they've just mapped out where people in the country can even get their news from. And I found this a really striking map the first time I saw it a couple years ago, because you can just see very clearly what we call news deserts. These are the orange places are places without a local news outlet. And a local news outlet could be like it could be a local paper, it could be a local radio station, it could even be like one of those alt weekly type things. I feel really lucky to have those, but if you don't have that, you are going to someone else. you're going to someone national or you're going somewhere else entirely to get any source of your news. And that's a tough thing that we know is really changing the landscape of conversation across the US right now. And it's a really big challenge for national outlets like ours as well, because it's hard to talk to a lot of different people in a lot of different places. I think we were talking during the student discussion about how to best get your information and your message across, and the best way you can do that is talk direct, like know who your audience is and tailor a conversation or a story for them. But you can't do that if you're trying to talk to, you know, the 300 million people across the US. And so we're just kind of always in this balance of being like, how do we reach the most number of people, and also how do we reach the few people that we actually really want to be talking to? And I don't think anyone has an answer for that right now. But certainly more news is almost always better. I mean, we can talk about that, but like the more outlets there are, I certainly think the better off we would be. So if I can put a plug in for everyone to support their local news networks, whatever they are. I'm not saying that for NPR, whatever your local news is, please help them out whenever you can. But I think all of this is just really important to think about right now, because like, as we all know, these problems are not going away. Even if we don't talk about them, they're still gonna be there. The risks are just gonna get bigger. And I think this question of how we reach people in this particular space of climate and help them understand that the global issues that are happening all around them are actually coming right to their doorstep and to their own doctor's offices or to their own medication needs and concerns and questions is really where, I don't know, I think it's a useful way to talk to people about stuff that feels too big to address on their own otherwise. And we love the Yale Center on Climate Communication, so thank you again for producing all of these maps that we can use. And yeah, I think that's it for now, but I'd love to have any questions that you have, and please just continue to consume news. We like that. That's really helpful, and interact with us when we reach out with you. But yeah, and please get in touch with me on Signal.
Stay up here. So thank you so much, Alejandra, and I should say Dr. Borunda for your talk. No, absolutely. And we do have a little time for questions, so don't be shy. Well, okay. Well, okay, maybe I have a quick one. So at what point does the story, like what point does a study become stale? So you said March to July, right? But like, is 1 year too long? Like at what point does it not become recent?
Yeah, great question. I think we have a couple different, it's really context. This is such an unsatisfying answer. It's very context dependent. I think if we're going to be covering it as like that standalone study story, new science just came out and we're going to tell you about it. Probably a month or two is my outer limit for that. If we are doing a story that is more like, what is the state of the science? Like, what is our new research on heat resilience, or like, I don't know. Yeah, like wildfire smoke toxicity at inhalation or something. Like, then I might tie together like, it might be years, honestly. It might be like the last 2 years of new research or something. So we've got a lot more flexibility there. I'm trying to think if there's another, I mean, I am literally going to publish a story on Wednesday that is looking at the Harvard 6 Cities study. So, 30 years. So it's flexible.
I'll just talk loud. I'm wondering if you're thinking about, I think for at least the next 4 years, there are going to be a lot of really important stories about how what the government is not doing or is coming back on will affect health, related to climate change. So I'm wondering if that's something that, your team has been thinking about.
Yes. The question was essentially for the next several years of the new administration, given what we've seen thus far, we expect there to be some changes in the way that, trying to be careful here, sorry, prioritization of issues that will probably affect people in both the climate space and the health space. How are we planning to cover that? Is that a, yeah, so our team is doing a lot, we are in the process of, I mean, we're always kind of just trying to figure out what the strategy is. Right now, I think we're trying to keep track of everything that's happening and keep track of all of the programs that are being cut or diminished, or, I mean, the regulations that are rolled back, which has not happened yet, but we're keeping track of them. It's a really big project. I think we are a bit in catcher mode right now, trying to assess. And of course, the next step is to try to communicate the potential losses at stake. I mean, for me, I cover air quality and air pollution as well. And so, of course, like one of the big questions is what's going to happen to all of the regulations that exist right now in the air quality space. And like a way that I'm hoping that we'll be able to address that is to find a community that has recently done quite a bit of work, of course, you know, to like upgrade, to improve their local air quality, hopefully because of regulatory issues. And like a long-term way that we would cover that is, of course, to like go back to that community over time and see the actual impacts. That is a hard, long project that's going to take years. And so we will probably try to pick that off in pieces. And so the challenge is always to talk about what is real and talk about what the potential impacts are without going into speculation. But in this effort, all of you are, again, incredibly helpful. If you can help us figure out places we should be focusing on, if you are doing your own work to do ongoing air quality monitoring, for example, in places where those issues are like the actual monitoring, you know, may become less efficient or effective, like those are the kinds of stories we can tell. And in that case, like the data is incredibly important, right? Like I can tell you that things are gonna get worse all day long, but until I talk to the people who are A, showing me that that's true, and B, showing me what the impacts are, like those stories are, again, kind of unsatisfying. So yeah, we're kind of trying to figure out like which pieces to be focusing on. The climate and health space is especially tricky, I would say, right now, because a lot of things were kind of nascent. There are a lot of plans to do work that had not quite gotten off the ground yet. And so it's harder to talk about losses for things that like didn't quite exist yet. But I really welcome any suggestions or ideas for specific things we can and should be following. But it's a real challenge. We need like 17 times as many journalists to keep track of everything, I think.
Let me give you the mic. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to say I love NPR, listen to it every day, so it's really cool to be able to here today. But I was kind of curious. So like I feel like I've read a lot about how like some people who are like a little bit skeptical about climate change are more moved by like personal stories or things that like are climate change affiliated, but like we're not explicitly saying like this is like climate change. But I feel like a lot of the examples you provided explicitly say like this is because of climate change, things like that. So I was curious, like a big of an organization like NPR, like what kind of like mission or goal there is of like finding that balance between like how do we catch people who might like if they see climate change in the headline, like maybe they won't read it. So just like finding that balance of being able to communicate and catching people like wherever they are on that spectrum.
Yeah, that's a great conversation or question. And we had a really nice conversation about this earlier. I'm happy to have it again with you more as well. And to be clear, I do not speak for NPR. I speak for myself. NPR, yeah, and I can speak for myself and I can tell you kind of what I've thought about and our team has thought about. But I think this is that's a really good question, and it's a really hard one because when I was talking about kind of the progression of climate journalism over the past, decade, 15 years-ish, like I think that there is a real tendency amongst people who were steeped in that early era to still be thinking in those terms and to be like, we have to call everything climate change. We have to put a name on it in order to make it very clear like what we are talking about. And that like there is a culprit here and it is human caused climate change. Talk about the term human caused if we want as well. We do know that that turns some people off. And it's a constant balance to figure out who you want to be talking to in any given moment. And I think our team has very much has leaned on like making it explicit, but sometimes trying to bring it in. Well, let me talk about myself. I like to kind of bring it in later in stories if possible. I don't want to lead any of my stories with the climate context. You kind of have to in the formats that we use, especially for radio, because we have like that little host intro where the host is talking and telling you what you're going to be listening to the next 4 minutes. And that's actually what draws people in and keeps people in. And so it's hard to keep climate change out of that headline or host intro section. We have done it occasionally. We don't have good enough metrics to know exactly like if that's working for some of our other audiences. In the story itself, though, I try to tell the whole story and lay out the ideas and concepts and then bring the climate piece in kind of right at the end to be like, oh, we know what's happening. Goodbye, the end. But like what the balance is, that's really tricky. And I think this is where, to get back to that issue of local news versus national news and how people are getting their information, like this is what, like you lose that nuance when you're talking to a national audience. You don't get to make a different story for someone in a part of the country, like a farmer versus, someone in one of the coastal cities. If you have a local station, they can do something differently. They can write the climate story and not include the terms. And that may be useful, but that is just like fundamentally the problem and the tension right now is that like we can't exactly choose our audiences. And so we kind of do the thing that we think works for a lot of people, but I think that's an open question. I don't know. Good question. I can hang out.
So Alejandra can actually hang out. I think for the purposes of wrapping up the webinar, we'll do that just because we're at the hour and then we'll chat afterwards. So I think without further ado, Alejandra, thank you so much for spending the day with us, spending the day with everyone here, just being so gracious and generous with your insights and really inviting us to be part of the conversation. Because I don't think it's very usual for us to be in these spaces and to have you and just have your insights as a journalist. So we really appreciate you and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon here. Hope everyone has a good rest of your day. And thank you again for joining us. Take care.